Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's top 5 best and worst Star Trek film villains. In this video, I'll count down my 5 favorite and my 5 least favorite villains from the Star Trek films. This countdown will only contain villains from the Star Trek films and not the Star Trek TV shows, otherwise this would be a very different list. I did decide to include the J.J. Abrams reboot series in this list, even though I don't really consider those films Star Trek. They do have the Star Trek name, and technically they're Star Trek films, so I decided to go ahead and include these films as well because I needed more fodder for my worst list. Anyway, so the Star Trek films in particular have been criticized for its lack of unique villains, many whom have been described as either two-dimensional or unnecessary. So I thought it would be interesting to have a look at what are my favorite villains from the films, the times I think they got it right, and which villains are my least favorites, so the times I think they got it completely wrong. So as always, these picks are just my opinion, and I know a lot of people are going to disagree with these opinions, and that's fine, but I always have to be honest with you guys and tell you what I really think, so I'm going to stay true to that no matter how unpopular some of these picks may be. So let me get into it, and let me start with my top 5 worst villains from the Star Trek films. So these are the villains that, to me, is where the Star Trek films got it absolutely wrong and are the prime examples of what people complain about. So coming in at number 5 worst villain is Sybok from Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. I'm not sure I'd call this character two-dimensional, as they did try to give this character dimension, but he was boring and silly. I mean, inventing a half-brother for Spock out of nowhere where it's never been mentioned before, is a very dumb concept, and that he's like the half and brother that embraces emotions where most Vulcans reject him was a bit silly. And he, forms a kind of religious cult where he brainwashes people, and he's on a quest to find God in the center of the galaxy for some reason. I don't know. Maybe it's because the movie he's in sucks so much, but he's just not a good villain. Next, on to my number 4 worst Star Trek villain, which is Ru'afo from Star Trek Insurrection. Another forgettable villain whom they tried to flesh out with a backstory but failed to make him interesting at all. The way he behaved was just so mustache-twirly evil that I just didn't buy his backstory for a single second, as it wouldn't explain why he's being such a stereotypical bad guy. And the way he just screams and throws temper tantrums is just so insincere and comes off as just cliched. Nothing against F. Murray Abraham, who is a good actor and tries his best with the material that he's given. It's just that the material that he's given sucks. And then they even throw on top of the stereotype cliche trope of his underling being discontent with him, so our heroes exploit him in order to defeat him. Please. Next, we'll move on to my number 3 worst villain, which is Krall from Star Trek Beyond. Now, I actually really liked Star Trek Beyond, and I thought it was the only one of these new reboot films that actually felt like a Star Trek movie, and it was by far the best. But its villain, Krall, was definitely the weakest thing about this film, and was the main thing holding it back from being a truly great film. Again, they got a great actor to play him with Elvis Elda, but the character was so flat and cliched, it was just grating. And when Ahura told him that her friends were coming to rescue her, and he's like, "I'm counting on it," I just rolled my eyes so hard that they nearly fell out of my head. And plus, the revelation of his backstory was so ridiculous, and I totally and completely did not buy it. Again, he felt like another villain that was just evil for the sake of being evil, so he was the only bad thing in an otherwise good movie. So on to my number 2 worst villain, which is Captain Klaa from Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. Yes, this movie is so bad it deserves a second entry on this list, and although it could be argued that Sybok was the main villain of The Final Frontier, the Klingon captain who was hunting Kirk was also another villain, and that's the thing. He was totally unnecessary, and the movie would have been just fine without him, but more than that, his motivations were the weakest in villain history. His whole purpose for going after Kirk was because he wanted to make a name for himself by killing the great Captain Kirk. Oh, come on. That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And on top of that, the way that he was defeated was so childish and ridiculous. A Klingon ambassador orders him to surrender to Kirk, and you see him show up and go, "I apologize." What is he, 6? Is he like a schoolyard bully or a starship commander? This, I almost feel, is the worst example of a villain in any movie. However, I did have to take into account that he wasn't the main villain of the film and played a somewhat smaller role, which is why he didn't come in at number 1. That honor goes to someone else. So, the number 1 worst villain in the Star Trek film is Nero from Star Trek 2009. Now, those familiar with my channel will know how much I hated Star Trek 2009, how I think it was just a giant mess and by far the worst of the reboot films, and a major part of what made this film so terrible was the main villain, Nero, who is one of the worst villains I've ever seen anywhere. This character is just so flat and cliched, it's ridiculous. As bad as villains like Ru'afo and Sybok are, at least the writers attempted to give them backstories and make them more sympathetic. With Nero, they didn't even try. They basically just said, "He's crazy," and just left it at that. Sure, they gave him a motivation by having him watch his homeworld destroyed, and apparently, his wife died of rip-off of Khan. But anyway, and then the quest he goes on to get revenge on Spock, where Spock was only trying to help, by the way. So he tries to get revenge on him by destroying all the Federation worlds. Makes no sense whatsoever. And in fact, none of the plot around his character makes any sense, as he just got sucked into the past. He waited around for 20 years, which is what he did because that was what was shown to us in the movie. I don't give a shit about what happens in any accompanied comic book. So anyway, he waited around for 20 years, and then he sets off a plan to destroy Vulcan, which he accomplished far too easily, and all the time he's screaming for Spock's head. "I want Spock dead!" None of this really makes any sense, and ultimately this character isn't given any traits, nor depth, nor character beyond that he's crazy. He just pops up from time to time and acts all edgy and cool, and it's like, hi Christopher, I'm Nero. And then he kills people, I guess for no reason. I don't know. I mean, this character is so bad, I even find it comical. I must admit, I do get some enjoyment out of watching this character because he's just so poorly written. Such as when he's talking to Pike and he says, "It happened. Don't tell me it didn't happen. It happened." My God, it's just useless nonsense to the point I'm completely flabbergasted on how anyone can even enjoy this film, as the main villain is nothing more than a two-dimensional, stereotypical caricature whose actions and motivations make no sense whatsoever, making Nero the number 1 worst villain of the Star Trek movies. So now let me get into my top 5 best villains from Star Trek movies. These are examples when the Star Trek films got it right and prove wrong the adage that Star Trek movies can't do villains well. Coming in at number 5 for Best Star Trek Movie Villain is General Chang from Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. General Chang was a unique villain in the Star Trek film catalog because unlike most villains who are either motivated by revenge or just being crazy or both, Chang was a level-headed, intelligent military man whose motivations were entirely political in nature. He had no ill will towards Kirk. In fact, he really admired Kirk, but they were just on opposite sides of a political situation. So Chang did what he had to do in order to affect politics in the way that he wanted to. In this case, making sure peace between the Federation and the Klingons didn't happen. Christopher Plummer does an amazing job of playing this highly intelligent general, and verbally sparring matches that he has with Kirk are just amazing. And part of what makes this villain so effective is that he has a massive advantage over Kirk. He's always one step ahead, as he had elements of this planned conspiracy already in place, including a spy on Kirk's ship, and he has a Klingon ship capable of firing while cloaked, which gives him enormous power, which makes it so much more exciting when Kirk and crew are able to overcome him, making him a prime example of how to do a villain right. Coming in at number 4 is no villain from Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. Okay, I'll admit this entry is kind of a cop-out, as by definition this entry isn't a villain, but that's the whole point, that you can make a great Star Trek movie without a villain, and that's something the Star Trek franchise would lost sight of, and we continue to just have throwaway bad guys like the aforementioned Ru'afo and Nero. But some movies, such as Star Trek Generations, would have actually been better without a villain, as the villain isn't really needed. And Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home is the only Star Trek movie that tries this. Now, I've heard others claim that Star Trek the Motion Picture also doesn't feature a villain, but that's totally not true. V'ger most definitely is the villain. Even though we don't truly meet V'ger until towards the end of the film, he turns out not really to be a villain. He is the main threat that puts Earth in danger, and more importantly, his presence is felt throughout the entire film. Be it from his expansive ship or his probe replicant of Lieutenant Ayala, you always feel V'ger's presence throughout the entire film, so he most definitely is the villain of Star Trek the Motion Picture. Now, some may try to make the argument for the alien probe being the villain of Star Trek IV, as like V'ger, it puts Earth in danger, but unlike V'ger, its presence isn't felt throughout the film, and it's more of just a coda at the start and at the end of the film that creates a crisis for the crew to overcome, so not a villain. Now, some may claim that the whalers are the villains of Star Trek 4, but most people who do so jokingly, because come on, they're in it for less than a minute. And although this film does paint whalers as the bad guys, they are by no means the villain of the film. And thus, there is no real villain. It's just the crew trying to deal with the alien culture of Earth's own past in order to overcome a crisis, where you get a lot of great character interactions, which is known mostly for comedy, but it also has a lot of heart as well, proving that you do not need to have a villain in every Star Trek film in order to make it great. And I think that's an important lesson that this freaking franchise needs to remember. Next, on to my number 3, which is John Harrison, aka Khan, from Star Trek Into Darkness. Now, this one may be a more controversial pick, because I know many people had a problem with Into Darkness and the whole concept of doing Khan again, but I actually preferred Into Darkness to Star Trek 2009, even though the sequel carries over a lot of the same issues that movie had, such as a nonsensical universe and people being able to do stuff that just out of nowhere that makes no sense. But I did find that it did improve upon the first reboot in several ways, such as the Kirk and Spock relationship, but most importantly, the villain was far superior, and I dare say one of the best villains in any Star Trek film. A lot of people like to complain about how unoriginal it is to simply do Khan again, but I would argue almost every film has been doing Khan over again, from Soren to Shinzon to Nero to Krall, but at least Into Darkness was open and honest. Hey, we're doing Khan again. And I can respect that. But in true Star Trek form, this is basically like a parallel universe version of Khan, which I find really interesting, and we see what would have happened to him had history gone down differently. And just as a villain in his own right, I found him brilliant, as in The Wrath of Khan, we're constantly told Khan has superior intellect and strength, but we're rarely actually shown it. Here, we get to see Khan's superiority actually play out and hinder the crew as they struggle to overcome him. Not only that, but he's a really fleshed out and three-dimensional character, one whom you can sympathize with. Now, I know some believe you sympathize with him too much and would take his side over Kirk's side, but I disagree with that, as his tactics were shown to have a clear lack of concern for life, but the fact that you can see his point of view only makes him a better villain. And let's be honest here, if you take off the nostalgia goggles, you have to admit that Benedict Cumberbatch Cumberbatch is an infinitely better actor than Ricardo Montalban, and his performance here as Khan is far superior. Come on, take the glasses off, you know it's true. Anyway, coming in at number 2, best Star Trek villain is probably another controversial pick, is Shinzon from Star Trek Nemesis. Now, Nemesis did have its low points, but I think this film gets far more hate than it deserves, and is in fact one of my favorite Star Trek films. Like Into Darkness, it also tries to emulate the Wrath of Khan a bit too much. However, I felt Shinzon was a truly unique villain separate from Khan, as Shinzon was a clone of Picard, which forced Picard to go head-to-head with a darker version of himself, but because like General Chang before him, Shinzon's motivations were more political rather than revenge-based, but his upbringing also did inform his character as he grew up in a dark and dreary situation, being oppressed by the Romulan people, and was raised and looked after by the Remans, so it makes sense that he would form a bond with the Remans, and this would inform his character and differentiate him from Picard. And seeing the two of them go to head, I personally thought it was awesome. And I personally see Shinzon as the success story of what they attempted and failed to do with Nero by having a villain who is much more dark and grittier than the previous villains that we've seen. Unlike Nero, who has no depth and just is a shallow gag, you actually understand Shinzon's plight, and so when he lashes out, it is far more believable, and he's not just being crazy for the sake of being crazy. You actually understand the grittiness and darkness behind this character. I mean, the guy even dies like a boss as he crawls down the pipe, sticking into his gut to just stare Picard in the face as he dies. This is such a great villain. And on top of that, this performance introduced me to Tom Hardy, who I dare say has given the best performance of any Star Trek villain in any Star Trek film, but that's just my opinion. So finally, let me get to my number 1 favorite Star Trek movie villain, and that is Khan from Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And I know this will come as no big surprise to anyone. It's kind of a safe pick, but there's a reason why practically every Star Trek movie that came after this one would try to emulate this villain, because he just worked so well in this film. Part of the reason was having the strange dynamic of someone with superior intellect and intelligence, and yet someone who was completely blinded by their need for revenge. And the way that it played out, you completely bought Khan's plight. What's more interesting is that William Shatner and Ricardo Montalban never actually appeared on screen together. However, the chemistry between them and their epic struggle still came through extremely strong, and in fact was the very effective driving force of this film, which is generally considered the best Star Trek film ever made. There's something to be said about how terrifying Khan was in this film, has that the first time we see him, he's putting these disgusting bugs into Chekhov's ear in order to brainwash him, and then he successfully poses as another Starfleet ship and very nearly destroys the Enterprise. And throughout the movie, he has the upper hand in his very menacing driving force, while staying true to his character and having a lot of dimension, which is everything that you want in a great villain, making him the best Star Trek movie villain. So that's it for my top 5 best and worst Star Trek movie villains. Be sure to check out my channel, as I do many more Star Trek videos, as well as cover many other videos on other shows like Game of Thrones, Dark Matter, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.